Welcome back, Deep Divers. Today, we're going urban. We're diving into Reescribiendo la Ciudad Abierta, which means rewriting the open city. It's by D.Navas, and, well, we're going to see how cities change, how they grow. And we'll be looking at two big names, Barcelona and New York City.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it is. Now, to help us unpack all this, we have with us, well, a real expert on cities, urban design, history, the whole 9 yards. So let's get right to it.
Right.
I think most people have these images, right? Barcelona, all that beautiful Gaudi architecture, bathed in sunshine, the perfect example of open, egalitarian design. And then there's New York, the concrete jungle crammed into a rigid grid. But what if, and this is where it gets interesting, what if those pictures in our heads, they're a bit too simple?
Cities are tricky. They're like living things, always changing, evolving in ways, well, even the people who planned them couldn't have imagined. Barcelona and New York, they're perfect examples. I mean, their stories, they really illustrate how dynamic this whole process is.
So, okay, where do we begin? How do we untangle these ideas about these two cities? Because they're so different, right?
Their origins are a good place to start, I think. Barcelona, you mentioned it, often gets praise for its open design. It's a legacy from Ildefons Cerdà's plan back in 1859. Cerdà, he was a real visionary. He wanted a city for everyone with those wide avenues, lots of green spaces, and really focused on social equity.
Wow. That's incredibly progressive for the mid-1800s. I mean, it sounds like he was way ahead of his time.
Oh, he absolutely was. Cerdà was inspired by utopian thinkers like Etienne Cabet, William Morris. These guys believed in creating societies where social justice was paramount and where people lived in harmony with their environment. These very ideas, you can see them in Cerdà's plan for Barcelona.
So while Barcelona was being shaped by these utopian ideals, what was going on in New York, on the other side of the Atlantic,
Well, New York, they were taking a different route, a more, let's say, practical one. The commissioner's plan for Manhattan, that was in 1811, with its famous grid system. They put efficiency first and foremost, so everything was divided up into these neat rectangular blocks, streets all in a grid. And this, of course, made navigating easier, and it made dividing up the land, well, much simpler.
Ah, yes, the grid,
Yeah.
a source of endless frustration for anyone trying to get around, or so I've heard. So we have Barcelona striving for an open, equitable city, and New York going for structure and efficiency. It seems like they were headed in completely opposite directions.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But, and here's the twist, Navas argues that these cities, despite their different starting points, didn't exactly stick to the plan.
Wait a minute. They didn't stick to the plan? Are you saying Barcelona, the city designed for openness, didn't actually become that open city? And New York, with its grid, actually found a different kind of openness?
It really is quite fascinating. Let's look at Barcelona first. So, Cerdà's plan, it was groundbreaking, no doubt. But putting it into practice, well, that's a different story. Political corruption got in the way, bureaucratic hurdles. And you have to remember, society was changing too. All these factors, they led to deviations from that original vision.
So even with the best of intentions, reality has a way of complicating things. The classic clash between utopian ideals and the realities of power and politics.
Precisely. And the result, Barcelona, it became denser over time. Quite a departure from Cerdà's vision of those spacious avenues and abundant greenery. In fact, Navas co-authored a book called Montjuïc versus Barcelona. It sheds light on this very period, how the plan was affected, between 1859 and 1895.
Okay, so Barcelona took an unexpected turn. But how did gridlocked Manhattan find its own version of openness?
Think about it this way. The grid, it's two-dimensional, right? But New York City, they embraced the third dimension. They built up. Skyscrapers, those started popping up in the early 20th century. They completely changed the city's skyline and created this new kind of openness. You could call it vertical openness.
That's a fascinating point. So the city designed to be open horizontally ended up becoming denser, while the city seemingly confined by the grid actually found a unique form of openness by reaching for the sky. It's almost like they swapped destinies.
Exactly. And it shows just how complex and often unpredictable urban development can be.
I'm already looking at cities in a whole new way after this.
Yeah.
Barcelona, the champion of open design, getting denser, and New York, the grid city, finding openness in its verticality. It's mind-blowing. So where do we go from here? What's next in our deep dive?
Well, in the next part, we'll explore how these paths, these diverging paths, continued to play out during the 20th century. We'll focus particularly on Europe, where cities had to face war, rebuilding, and of course, changing social needs. It was a turbulent time for urban planning.
I can't wait to hear more about it. Sounds like we're just scratching the surface of this fascinating topic. Stay tuned, listeners. It's only going to get more interesting as we delve deeper into the evolving concept of the open city. So we saw how Barcelona and New York City, I mean, they started off on such different paths, but then things get kind of, well, twisted. What happened next? How did these cities keep evolving, especially as we move into the 20th century?
The 20th century, that's where things get really shaken up, especially in Europe. I mean, you had 2 world wars, complete devastation, and that forced people to rethink how cities should be designed.
Yeah, makes sense. Rebuilding after a war, dealing with all that upheaval, that must have really, well, it must have put practical needs front and center, right?
Oh, absolutely. Forget those grand utopian visions. It was all about finding solutions that worked right now. And that's really when we see this rise of standardized housing projects. Efficiency, making the most of resources, those are the priorities.
So it sounds like the architectural, I guess, idealism of the early 20th century took a back seat to the reality of rebuilding after the war. Are there are there any specific examples that show us this shift?
Oh, plenty. Take the Karl Marx Hof in Vienna, for instance. It was built in 1926, and it's this huge residential complex. I mean, really grand with all these ornate details. It really embodies those pre-war social housing ideals. But then, just a few years later, you have the Dammerstock colony in Germany. That was 1929, designed by Walter Gropius.
Gropius, the Bauhaus guy, right? It's in pictures of his work. It's all very, very minimal, very functional.
Exactly. Gropius, along with architects like Otto Heisler, they were pioneers of this new approach, functionalism. It emphasized simplicity, standardized designs, the kind of stuff you could build quickly and efficiently. The Dammerstock colony, with its rows of these low-rise buildings, that's a classic example. And then there's Gropius's later work at Siemensstadt, also in Berlin. That was 1930, another massive housing project, same philosophy.
So it sounds like there was a real turning point, moving away from those elaborate designs and toward a more streamlined aesthetic, focused on practicality. But did this focus on function mean that beauty was just completely abandoned in urban design?
Not quite. Even within functionalism, they understood that people needed livable spaces. Gropius, for example, he always stressed how important light and air were, green spaces in these housing projects. It was just that the emphasis, well, it shifted to finding practical solutions for a society that was picking up the pieces.
It's really amazing how all these events, these ideologies, they shaped how cities actually look and feel. And where does Le Corbusier fit into all of this? I mean, he was such a giant in 20th century architecture.
Le Corbusier, now he's an interesting case. He was all about these radical, large-scale changes to cities. His Plan Voisin for Paris back in 1925, he actually wanted to demolish a huge chunk of central Paris and replace it with, get this, skyscrapers surrounded by these vast green spaces.
Wow, that's pretty radical. I can't imagine that went over very well.
Oh, it was incredibly controversial, of course. But it shows you how much Le Corbusier believed that architecture, urban planning, that they could completely transform cities. But even Le Corbusier, his thinking changed over time. He started to realize that these top-down approaches, well, they had their limits. And he began to appreciate, the complexity of cities a little more.
So even the most radical thinkers had to adapt to reality, huh? It seems like the 20th century was a period of constant learning, constant adjustments when it comes to urban planning.
Absolutely. And as we moved into the later part of the century, this idea of cities being complex, it really took hold. Those big, utopian projects from earlier, they gave way to a more gradual approach.
Can you give us, some examples of this new way of thinking about urban planning?
Sure. Look at the Ville Nouvelle projects in France. They started in the 1960s, and the idea was to build these entirely new towns outside the big cities. But, a lot of these projects, they had trouble creating these truly vibrant communities. Sometimes they ended up feeling isolated, disconnected.
Sounds like that recurring theme, huh? The grand vision bumping up against real life human experience.
Exactly. And this led to a shift towards smaller scale interventions, focusing on improving existing areas and really getting local communities involved. For instance, in France, they have the ZAC, the Zone d'Aménagement Concerté. Basically, they targeted specific areas for redevelopment, but they did it in partnership with the people who lived there. It was more collaborative, a ground-up approach.
So moving away from those big pronouncements, those, sweeping statements, and towards something more, I guess, collaborative, more responsive to the specific context, sounds like a pretty big change in how people were thinking.
It was a recognition that that cities are these complex systems. You've got social factors, economic factors, environmental factors, all influencing things. And this realization, it led to some pretty important trends that are still shaping urban planning today.
All right, I'm all ears. Tell me about these trends. What's shaping the cities of the future?
Well, one major trend is moving away from those rigid, one-size-fits-all designs. Cities are always changing, right? So the way we design them has to be able to adapt to those changes.
Makes sense. That whole one-size-fits-all approach, it just wouldn't work in a place that's so dynamic.
Right. And alongside adaptability, well, sustainability is becoming crucial. Cities have a huge impact on the environment. So urban planning is now incorporating, environmental responsibility, resource efficiency, climate resilience. It's not just some niche thing anymore. It's a core principle.
Yeah, I think we're seeing that shift everywhere now. And of course, we can't forget about technology.
Absolutely. I mean, look at all these smart city initiatives, online platforms for people to, get involved in their communities. Technology is changing how we design, how we manage, how we even experience cities.
Wow. When you think about how far urban planning has come, from those post-war efforts to sustainable design, smart cities, it's really incredible.
It really is. And all of these trends are coming together to create this new understanding of what an open city can be in the 21st century.
So what does all this mean for the rest of us? The people who live in these cities, who work in them, who experience these changes every day? What are the takeaways?
Well, we need to pay attention. We need to be aware of what's shaping our cities. And we need to get involved in the decisions that affect our urban environments.
I like that, a call to action. Become more conscious citizens of our cities.
Exactly. And remember, open city, it's not just about physical space, it's about social openness too. It's about creating cities that are inclusive, equitable, accessible to everyone. Such a good point. It can't just be about beautiful buildings and efficient transportation. Cities have to work for everyone.
That's right. And that requires us to change our mindset a bit. We need to see ourselves not just as consumers of urban space, but as co-creators of our cities.
This has been a truly insightful conversation. I mean, we've covered so much, from grand visions to those practical solutions, from war-torn cities to the challenges of sustainability.
We have, and I think it all points to this one key takeaway. Cities are always changing, and it's up to us to help shape their future.
We've really gone deep on this one, from those 19th century utopian dreams to functionalism, sustainability. But now I'm thinking, what about us? How do we take all these ideas about cities, about urban planning, and apply it to, our everyday lives?
It begins with just looking around. Next time you're walking around your neighborhood, really pay attention. How does the built environment make you feel? Could you see the things we've talked about, like the grand visions, the compromises they had to make, the need for practicality? I like that. It's like turning your walk to work into this architectural scavenger hunt.
Exactly. And when you start seeing your city like that, you can't help but interact with it differently. You might find yourself asking, why is this park designed this way? Or how does that building, work with the street? Or even, what could be better?
It's about going from just seeing things to actually thinking about them.
And that thinking, well, it can lead to doing something. Maybe you go to a community meeting about a new development project, or you push for more green spaces in your area. You can actually be part of shaping your city.
It's kind of empowering when you realize that we all have a role to play in, creating the cities we want.
Right. And don't forget, open city, it's not just about physical space. It's about being open socially. It's about making cities inclusive, equitable, accessible for everyone.
That's such a crucial point. We can't just focus on, fancy buildings and efficient transit.
Yeah.
Our cities have to work for all the people who live there.
Absolutely. And that means we have to shift our thinking a bit, see ourselves not just as, using the city, but as contributing to it as co-creators.
This deep dive has been amazing, seriously thought-provoking. We've learned so much about how cities evolve, how they adapt, and how we can all be part of shaping their future.
It's been a pleasure sharing these ideas. Cities are endlessly fascinating, and I hope our conversation has inspired you to, see your own city in a new light.
A huge thank you to our expert for taking us on this incredible journey. You've really helped us understand and appreciate our urban environments in a whole new way. And to all our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, about the cities you live in, the cities you dream of. So the next time you're out exploring those concrete landscapes, remember, you're not just passing through. You're a citizen, a co-creator, and you have a voice in shaping the future of your city. Keep exploring, Keep asking those questions and keep imagining what's possible. Until next time.